Today, Washington and Tehran can't even agree on whether Tehran ever agreed, and the inspectors are caught in the middle. If you're just joining us, here's where we are. The U.S.-Iran track opened with the Islamabad MOU, giving both sides a 60-day window to turn battlefield de-escalation into a final deal. Delegations have been meeting in Switzerland on sanctions relief, frozen assets, nuclear terms, the Strait of Hormuz, and Lebanon. Washington also issued a 60-day waiver for Iranian oil sales, tied to the MOU conditions, making the relief real while the talks keep going.
This is Iran War Daily, Day 117. The Senate just voted to halt the war while the Pentagon asks for $80 billion to fund it. Same building, same week.
We start with the inspections fight and whether anyone actually agreed to let the IAEA back in. This one's from military.com.
The U.S. and Iran were in dispute Tuesday over whether Tehran had agreed to allow UN inspectors to view bombed Iranian nuclear sites, as officials mediated talks on a permanent end to their war and violence broke out again in Lebanon. The differing accounts came as Iran's president met with Pakistani officials mediating negotiations, and while technical teams were working on details following talks in Switzerland between the U.S. and Iran.
Here's the contradiction at the center of this. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Esmail Baghai told reporters in Tehran the UN inspectors aren't scheduled to see the bombed sites, flatly refuting Vice President Vance from a day earlier. Trump answered on social media, saying Iran agreed to inspections long into the future, and without that, quote, there would be no further negotiations. The IAEA itself, notably, has not said a word.
So the one commitment Besson put on the record Monday is the one Tehran's now disputing on the record Tuesday. Access to those bombed sites. That was the seam I said the one-pager never closed. And watch the other line in this AP file. The IMO's evacuating 11,000 stranded seafarers through Hormuz. A fifth of the world's oil and gas used to move through that mouth before the war. The real economy tell is there, not in the press releases.
And the editor's note on this is exactly right. The 60-day window now turns on two unsettled things at once: whether inspectors actually land, and what the Hormuz rules mean in practice. Patricia Zengerle, writing in Military Times.
The U.S. Senate backed legislation on Tuesday directing President Donald Trump to halt U.S. military action against Iran, the latest rebuke of the Republican president from an increasingly restive Congress. The Senate voted 50-48 in favor of the War Powers Resolution, which passed the House of Representatives early this month, reflecting growing concern even among some of Trump's Republicans about the unpopular conflict that began on February 28th when the U.S. and Israel launched an attack on Iran.
The number here is 50-48. The Senate joined the House Tuesday in directing Trump to halt U.S. military action against Iran. And per Military Times, it's the first time both chambers have passed a War Powers Resolution since the act was written in 1973.
First time since '73, and it took 4 of Trump's own Republicans crossing the aisle to get there. His party's cracking on a war that started February 28th.
And the piece is honest about the limits here, quote, likely to remain largely symbolic. Congress is on record, but this doesn't move troops by itself.
Symbolic until you put it next to the bill that's still coming this hour. Congress tells him to stop the war on one track, while the Pentagon walks in asking them to fund it on another. The appropriators actually have to answer one of those votes.
Right, and 50-48 is nowhere near veto-proof, so this is a rebuke on the record, not a binding constraint, and Trump knows the difference. From WSMV.
The Pentagon has told senators it needs roughly $80 billion, mostly to cover the cost of the U.S. war against Iran, adding to what is already a sizable military spending boost being sought by President Donald Trump. The White House Office of Management and Budget has yet to make a formal request to Congress, but Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has been making the rounds on Capitol Hill, including Monday evening.
So in the same week the Senate votes to halt the war, Hegseth's walking the halls asking for $80 billion to fund it. 2 votes, opposite directions, Same building.
And the sourcing matters here. OMB hasn't made a formal request yet. This is Hegseth and a deputy defense secretary briefing senators, per two people not authorized to speak. The Wall Street Journal reported it first. The $80 billion is a number being floated on the Hill, not a line item Congress has seen on paper.
And it lands on top of a $1.5 trillion Pentagon ask, nearly 50% over this year. So the war-ending deal Trump's selling needs $80 billion in fresh money just to replenish what got spent ending it.
Thune's careful on it. He says he expects a supplemental, and when it lands, quote, "We'll work through it and see where the votes are." He did not give a yes. He sounds like a leader counting heads in a chamber that just voted to curb the war. WANA news agency writes,
Speaking during his return flight from Switzerland, Ghalibaf stated that while Iran would continue to comply with international law, the strategic waterway would be administered according to Iranian arrangements and remain under Iranian management. I was among the first to state at the beginning of the war that the administration of the Strait of Hormuz would never return to its previous status, he said.
This is the first detailed Iranian account of what Switzerland actually produced. Ghalibaf, head of the negotiating team, speaking on his flight home, per WANA. And he says it plainly. The Strait of Hormuz won't return to its pre-war status, and it'll be managed under what he calls Iranian arrangements.
There it is. The Hormuz number I've been chasing all week. And now there's a name attached to it. Iranian arrangements. Sounds like a choke point claim dressed up in diplomatic clothes.
Hold the distinction, though. Ghalibaf says international regulations will be respected, but managed by Iran. Rubio's been insisting the waterway stays freely open to international shipping. Those two readings of the same talks don't match.
Right, and Vance called Switzerland a good foundation. Foundation for what? A strait that Tehran says it now runs? Both sides walked out claiming opposite wins. One of them selling something to the folks back home.
And notice the audience. A big chunk of Ghalibaf's remarks were aimed at domestic critics, defending diplomacy as complementary to military force. He was talking to Tehran as much as Washington. Al Jazeera, with Elizabeth Melamopoulos.
Iran and the United States have offered conflicting accounts of key issues as negotiators work towards a final agreement within a 60-day window. Differences remain over nuclear oversight and the implementation of any deal, underscoring the challenges facing both sides. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Iran would not be allowed to charge tolls in the Strait of Hormuz under a final agreement, stressing that the strategic waterway must remain open to international shipping.
Rubio says Iran won't charge tolls in Hormuz. Ghalibaf's Swiss readout, the one we hit earlier, says Iran got to manage the strait. Somebody's lying about what got signed, and the ships pay either way.
Here's the cleaner version. Trump said Tehran accepted the highest level of monitoring. Tehran, on the record, says it agreed to no such thing. That's the first flat-out factual contradiction between the two capitals this week, and it's on the central nuclear question.
This is what I flagged from day one. A 60-day window, technical teams finalizing, and they can't even agree on whether the inspectors are allowed in the door. You don't paper over IAEA access. That's the whole deal.
One more thing in this rundown that doesn't get filed under diplomacy. General Portistan says Iran's army has shifted to an offensive doctrine, preemptive operations included. That's a posture statement landing the same day the inspection account falls apart.
If Iran War Daily helps you stay on top of this fast-moving story, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you're listening. It only takes a moment, and it helps other people find the show. Next, we're watching for a formal OMB request to Congress on the Pentagon's roughly $80 billion Iran war ask. We're also watching how the IMO carries out the plan to evacuate 11,000 stranded seafarers through the Strait of Hormuz, and whether the IAEA says anything about access for inspectors at the bombed Iranian enrichment sites. Links to every story we covered are in the show notes, if you want to read further on anything that caught your ear. That's Iran War Daily for today. This is a Lantern Podcast.